Welcome students to exercise 19, which is going to focus on the gross anatomy of the spinal cord as well as the spinal nerves, since they originate on the spinal cord even though they are part of the peripheral nervous system. In terms of what our spinal cord does for us, it's mostly really just communication between the brain and the rest of the peripheral, the rest of the nervous system, the peripheral nervous system. So, like when information comes from the outside world or from internally and is sensed by the peripheral nervous system, that information's got to get into the brain, and then all of the kind of motor output for your brain to kind of control everything has to come out of the brain and out of the central nervous system. And that's essentially what the spinal cord does. It's really just like signals traveling through the spinal cord. The spinal cord itself does not really have an integrative function. It's not like making sense of the data and kind of figuring out what to do and activating an effector. The exception to that are the spinal reflexes. So things like the plantar reflex, where your toes curl over when the bottom of your foot is stimulated, or the patellar reflex, when your leg kind of kicks out when the patellar ligament is stimulated. It's a very common thing done at the doctor's office. Or even just our pain reflex, right? When you put your hand on a hot stove and you pull it away. That kind of integration takes place in the spinal cord, but that's really about it. There really isn't like high-level thought going on in the spinal cord. It's mostly just reflexive. If we look at the gross anatomy of the spinal cord, you'll see that it sits in the vertebral foramen inside the vertebrae, so it's nice and encased and protected. So it has bony protection, just like the brain. It also has the three meningeal layers, just like the brain: dura mater, exterior, arachnoid mater, mid-membrane, and then the highly vascularized pia mater that clings to the spinal cord itself. You can also then see the spinal nerves and the roots of those spinal nerves coming out of the spinal cord, and then diverging kind of once they get out past it a little bit. Unlike the brain, the gray matter, white matter organization is flipped. So on the brain, it was gray matter outer cortex, white matter inner. Here, it's the gray matter that's inner and the white matter that's more exterior. So this kind of H or butterfly is the gray matter, where we find the cell bodies of all of our neurons, and then out here is the white matter, where we find essentially just axons, taking information either to or from the brain. So if we look at the spinal cord, you'll see it comes out of the skull through the foramen magnum. That's where it attaches to the brainstem and then comes out of the skull. And then it actually ends around L1 or L2 at what we call the conus medullaris. And then the rest of it is actually extending down the rest of the vertebral column are essentially just nerves coming down. And those nerves, if we zoom in here, let me see if I can zoom in here a little bit, right? They look kind of like the back of a horse, the tail on a horse. And so this extension of these nerves is called the cauda equina. Cauda means tail, equina means horse, and so it's this horse tail of nerves that extends from the conus medullaris. You'll also see the filum terminale, which is the extension of the pia mater. Remember, the spinal cord ends up here, so the meninges end here. The exception to that is the pia mater. It extends down through the cauda equina. In the cervical region of the spinal cord and the lumbar region of the spinal cord, you will find kind of two enlargements in terms of the overall kind of size of the spinal cord. And this is where the nerves for our limbs, upper and lower, enter and exit the spinal cord, and so that needs a little bit more space. So the thoracic region of the spinal cord is actually skinnier than the cervical and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. So let's look at the gray matter, right? So again, picture the H or the butterfly, right? It's got horns, right? So we've got dorsal, posterior horns, and then ventral and anterior horns. And then in the thoracic and lumbar regions, we actually have lateral horns that come out the sides. So the dorsal horns have sensory neurons from the dorsal root ganglion. So they're taking information into the spinal cord, into the central nervous system. The ventral horns contain motor neurons that exit out the ventral root of the spinal cord, carrying motor information, efferent information. And then the lateral horns in the parts of the spinal cord that have them, they're not found everywhere, have motor neurons for the autonomic nervous system, the kind of involuntary nervous system. Connecting the two sets of horns is what we call a gray commissure. And in the middle of that commissure is then the central canal of the spinal cord. Now the commissure connects the right and left spinal cord so that we have communication between the right and the left. And then the central canal is actually continuous with the ventricles in the brain, and it gets filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So if we look at the gray matter, you can see dorsal horn, sensory information, ventral horn, motor information, and then these lateral horns found in the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord only. So here we have our dorsal root, here we have our ventral root. So the dorsal root is taking information into the dorsal horn, the ventral root is taking information out of the ventral horn. The central canal here, continuous with the spinal cord, continuous with the ventricles, filled with CSF, and that gray commissure that connects right and left. If we look then at the white matter, you'll see two fissures, a shallower sulcus in the back and a deeper fissure in the front. And then all of the rest of this, what you're looking at is cross sections through the axons. Those fissures create essentially regions of white matter columns or white matter tracts. You have ventral regions, lateral regions, and dorsal regions. And it's a mirror image. The same information is on the right side as on the left side. So everything that's an ascending tract on the right side is also an ascending tract on the left side. Everything that is a descending tract on the left side is also a descending tract on the right side. It's like mirror images, right? Carrying information from the different sides of the body. Now the axons themselves get like bundled together in relation to kind of how they function, where they start, where they end, and kind of what type of information they are carrying. So ascending tracts are carrying sensory information, so from the peripheral nervous system to the brain, and then the descending tracts are carrying motor information from the brain out to the peripheral nervous system. And so if we look, everything in blue are ascending tracts. Everything that's red is a descending tract. And when we look at it like this, we are looking at a cross section through the tract. Imagine a chain of neurons that we're going to see here in just a second. We're looking at a cross section through one of those neurons. So all of this that's blue, again, mirror image, right and left, is carrying sensory data. All of it that is red is carrying motor data. So let's look at what that looks like. This is an ascending tract. So you can see here is the neurons coming into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord and then up to the thalamus. That's our main relay station. And then from the thalamus out to whatever cortex it happens to be talking about. The image here, it happens to be the somatosensory cortex because we're talking temperature and pain. If we look at the descending tract, we're talking about motor neurons. So we're coming from the primary motor cortex, descending all down through the brainstem and the spinal cord, and then going out to our skeletal muscles in order to allow us to move, and that is coming out through the ventral root of the spinal cord. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, named for kind of whichever region of the spinal cord they come out of. They're actually just underneath the transverse processes. So you have 8 cervical nerves, 12 thoracic nerves, 5 lumbar nerves, 5 sacral nerves, and then 1 coccygeal nerve. All of the spinal cord nerves are mixed, so they're carrying both sensory and motor data, but the spinal nerves themselves are actually very, very, very short, because they almost immediately branch into what we call a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. The dorsal rami, that's what you see here, they tend to be smaller, and they're innervating kind of the posterior skin and muscles, but the ventral rami, particularly the ones not in the thoracic area here, become these really complicated nerve networks called plexuses. Now, T2 through T12, in terms of the ventral rami, serve the thorax, so kind of the trunk spaces, trunk skin, trunk muscles, breathing, or at least the intercostal spaces, not really breathing, but that kind of trunk area. And then we get these really complicated nerve plexuses everywhere else. And this is sort of what one of these plexuses looks like, and you can see it's really complicated looking, but the whole purpose of the nerve plexus is to allow kind of multiple routes of innervation. So for instance, if we look at the median nerve here, the median nerve gets a nerve supply from the 5th cervical spinal nerve through this pathway. It also can get innervation through the 5th and 6th nerve, through the 8th cervical and 1st thoracic, and go this way out to the median nerve. And so even if this area were damaged, you could still get innervation out to the median nerve through this kind of other pathway. And so by having all these other pathways, the skin and muscles of our limbs have kind of multiple routes of innervation. There are 4 major plexuses. We're looking, I think, at the brachial plexus in this particular image. But there's a cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, and lumbar and sacral plexuses. In terms of the cervical plexus, we're talking about the ventral rami from C1 and C4. And this is the shoulders and neck kind of skin and muscles. And the really important nerve of the cervical plexus is actually one of the most important nerves in your body. It's called the phrenic nerve. It is the motor supply to your diaphragm, and it is the only motor nerve supply to your diaphragm. And so if your phrenic nerve is damaged, you will not be able to breathe, which means you're not getting any oxygen in your body. That's an extremely important nerve. If we look at the brachial plexus, we're looking at C5 through T1 in terms of the ventral rami. This is for the skin and muscles of the upper limb. So the axillary nerve does the muscles in the skin of the shoulders, so like those deltoid muscles, right? The musculocutaneous nerve does the flexor muscles of the arm, and then kind of anterior skin of the forearm. The ulnar nerve does the muscles that are flexors in the forearm, so the flexor carpi, ulnaris, etc., etc. Also the intrinsic muscles that we find in the hand, and then like kind of the middle part of the skin in terms of the middle part of the hand. The median nerve does the lateral flexors in the forearm, and then also kind of the anterior skin of the hand. And then the radial nerve does the posterior extensor muscles, extensor carpi radialis. It also does the arm extensors as well. So things like the triceps brachii, and then all of the posterior skin of the upper limb. If we look at the lumbar plexus, we're looking at the ventral rami from L1 to L4. So we're looking at abdominal, pelvic, and kind of anterior thigh. Two major nerves of the lumbar plexus are the femoral nerve and the obturator nerve. The femoral nerve does skin of kind of anterior middle thigh, skin of kind of medial leg and foot, and then also all of the anterior muscles of the thigh. So things like your quadriceps femoris, right? Femoral. The femoral nerve is definitely going to be one that innervates that big muscle. And then the obturator nerve is very much a medial nerve, so it's going to do skin and muscles in the medial thigh. So things like the gracilis, things like the adductor muscles, etc., etc. The last plexus is the sacral plexus. So this is the ventral rami from L4 to S4, and this is kind of skin and muscles of the buttocks, the posterior thigh, and then the leg and foot. And it has one major nerve, and that is that big giant sciatic nerve that can often be the source of problems. It's actually two nerves in a common kind of bundle in the thigh. Those two nerves will branch just kind of after, so they travel a kind of common pathway in the thigh, and then they branch just proximally to the knee into the fibular nerve and the tibial nerve. So the common fibular nerve does the skin of kind of the anterior leg and the top of our foot, the dorsum of our foot, as well as the extensor muscles for the leg and that are in the leg that move the foot. And then the tibial nerve does kind of posterior leg and sole of foot skin, those posterior thigh muscles, so things like the hamstrings muscles, and then the flexor muscles that we find in the leg. And those are some of the kind of major nerves of the body.